I used to believe that if I worked hard enough, stayed late enough, delivered results sharp enough, someone in my family would finally see me. Not just as the youngest. Not just as the daughter. But as someone worthy of the Carter name. My name is Madison Carter, and if you've ever driven past a towering luxury development with clean lines, steel and glass stretching toward the clouds, chances are Carter and Sons architecture had something to do with it. For decades, the Carter name meant prestige, legacy, tradition. But what no one ever told you was that tradition can be a cage, especially when your name doesn't come with a GR or a seat at the smoke-filled boardroom. I grew up breathing blueprints. While most girls were playing house, I was sketching floor plans. My father used to joke that I learned to read by studying zoning maps. He told people I had spirit, the same way you might describe a dog that barks too much. Landon and Tyler, my two older brothers, were always the chosen ones. I was the extra, the tag-along, the cute mascot of family meetings. I didn't just want a seat at the table. I earned it. I got my MBA from Columbia with honors while working full-time in the family firm. I learned everything. Construction timelines, financial modeling, even the politics of land use committees. By 24, I was managing multi-million-dollar projects that kept entire divisions afloat. But no matter how much value I delivered, I was still Madison the assistant, in their eyes. Still the girl who brought coffee instead of capital. The moment that changed everything came during a quarterly leadership meeting. I suggested it was time to begin succession planning, to think about the future of the company beyond just the Carter name. I had a full proposal, 5-year growth roadmap, brand modernization ideas, even a rebranding strategy that would expand our demographic reach. My father cut me off mid-slide. "Madison," he said, barely glancing up, "you're not one of the boys. You don't have the edge." Silence. Tyler chuckled under his breath. Landon smirked. No one came to my defense. Not even the COO I had helped hire. My father leaned back and said, "You're passionate and that's fine. But this business, it's about instinct. Gut decisions. Men know how to do that. You care too much about details. About people. That's not how you win in this world." He thought he was helping me, protecting me from disappointment. But all I felt in that moment was confirmation. That night, I sat alone in the office I technically ran but would never have a title for. I stared out at the Boston skyline from the 23rd floor, watching the lights flicker in the buildings my father had designed. It should have felt like legacy. Instead, it felt like exile. I wasn't angry. Not yet. I was just tired of proving myself to people who had already made up their minds. But something inside me shifted. If the only thing keeping me from power was the belief that I didn't belong, then maybe it was time to stop asking for belief and start building something they couldn't ignore. So I stopped waiting for them to make space. And instead, I started imagining something entirely new, with no last names required. Even after that boardroom dismissal, some part of me still clung to the hope that if I created something brilliant enough, something undeniable, they'd finally see what I could bring to the table. So I buried myself in the work. For weeks, I lived in spreadsheets and vision decks, researching market shifts, sustainability trends, and emerging smart home integrations. I wasn't dreaming. I was designing a strategy that could take Carter and Sons into a future they hadn't even considered. I called the initiative Carter Reimagined. It wasn't just a new campaign, it was a complete pivot toward luxury smart architecture, carbon-neutral materials, tech-integrated living. No other firm on the East Coast was owning that space authentically yet. I laid out everything. Projections, target demographics, potential partnerships. I even brought in 2 colleagues from my MBA program to pressure test the model. It was airtight. I booked a presentation room in our headquarters, nothing too grand, just intimate enough to keep the focus on the work. I sent personal invites to my father, my brothers, the CFO, and a few key executives. I rehearsed until I could present it in my sleep. When the day came, I stood in front of them, palms damp, but voice steady, and walked them through the future. My vision of a Carter and Sons that embraced progress, captured untapped markets, and led the way instead of playing catch up. When I reached the final slide, I looked around, waiting for a reaction. What I got was silence. My father leaned back, arms crossed. "Are you done?" he asked. I nodded, not sure whether to feel hopeful or nauseated. He turned to Landon. "You want to explain to your sister why this would bury us?" Landon chuckled and flipped through the packet I'd prepared. "Madison, no offense, but this is a fantasy. You're pitching TED Talk ideas to a real-world construction firm. Smart homes, green materials. Our clients want timeless, not trendy." Tyler jumped in next. "Nice design work, though. Very slick. Maybe Pinterest has an opening." There were smirks, one muffled laugh. I looked at them, my family, my mentors, my supposed team, and realized none of them had really listened. My father didn't bother to criticize the numbers. He didn't even glance at my analysis. "You want to try this out," he said flatly. "Go ahead. Start your own firm. Just don't do it under our name." That moment wasn't just rejection. It was dismissal, exile, and a warning all in one. They weren't just uninterested in my ideas. They were terrified of what it meant if I was right. I gathered my materials, nodded once, and left the room without another word. They thought they were closing a door. But what they didn't realize was that they just handed me the reason to build my own. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay there in silence, staring at the ceiling as the dim light from the city spilled through the blinds, painting pale shadows across the walls of my apartment. The words from that meeting repeated in my head like a cruel mantra. Start your own firm. Just don't do it under our name. My father hadn't raised his voice, hadn't looked angry. He had just said it like it was a fact, like I was never meant to lead. The indifference hurt more than rejection. They didn't see me as a threat, or even a disappointment. They just didn't see me at all. And somehow, that was the clearest confirmation I'd ever received. I had spent years pouring everything I had into Carter and Sons. Working late nights, managing impossible projects, bending over backwards to prove I belonged. But I finally realized I had been knocking on a door they had no intention of opening. Not for me. Not ever. The next morning, before the sun was up, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee gone cold and pulled up a commercial real estate site I'd bookmarked months ago. It was just a dream back then. A tiny studio tucked between a florist and an antique bookstore on the edge of the city. Now, it felt like salvation. The place wasn't much. 600 square feet, cracked tile, uneven lighting, and a temperamental radiator. But it had potential. I scheduled a viewing, walked through it once, and signed the lease before the end of the day. It didn't need to be perfect. It just needed to be mine. At Carter and Sons, I packed my office quietly on a Saturday. No farewell speech. No team meeting. Just 3 cardboard boxes, my badge left on the desk, and a resignation letter that simply said, "Thank you for the opportunity." I didn't owe them explanations. I wasn't walking away in anger. I was walking towards something better. My new apartment wasn't glamorous either. A second-floor walk up with squeaky floors, peeling paint, and a window view of a brick wall. But it was quiet. It was mine. And for the first time, I could breathe. I turned that studio into my headquarters with nothing more than a second-hand desk, a borrowed chair, and a laptop that had already seen too many long nights. I created a folder on the desktop and named it Nova Forma. A new form. A new version of everything they said I could never be. I bought a roll of corkboard, pinned it to the wall, and stuck one note in the center. They gave you nothing. Build it anyway. And I did. Not with rage, not with revenge, but with something far stronger: vision, clarity, and the kind of quiet resolve that doesn't ask for recognition. It builds. It becomes undeniable. Starting Nova Forma wasn't glamorous. There were no investor calls, no sleek launch party, no press coverage. It began in a room that smelled faintly of plaster and old wood, with a salvaged desk, a flickering desk lamp, and a space heater that rattled whenever I plugged in my laptop. I cleaned the place myself, scrubbing floors, repainting the scuffed walls, taping up a vision board I cut out from an old poster frame. Every detail, every hour spent in that room felt like an act of defiance, but also like a homecoming. I wasn't trying to impress anyone anymore. I was trying to build something that felt like it belonged to me. I started small. I emailed every contact I had built over the years, the ones who had spoken to me directly on Carter & Sons projects, but never looked past my last name. I pitched niche eco, luxury renovations, custom smart home upgrades, design solutions that married technology with aesthetic warmth. Most said no. Some didn't reply at all, but a few said yes, and those few became everything. I poured myself into each project. I sketched layouts in coffee shops, negotiated materials with vendors over video calls, worked late into the night assembling presentations I would later pitch to clients who were used to high polish. I wasn't polished yet, but I was real, and that was my advantage. My first hire was a part-time assistant with an architecture degree and a chip on her shoulder bigger than mine. She had been passed over at 2 firms for speaking up too often. I didn't see that as a flaw. I saw it as a necessity. We worked side by side, sometimes from the same folding table, drafting, designing, editing contracts. My second hire was a project manager I met at a panel talk. Organized, brilliant, and tired of being told to wait his turn. We became a trio of quiet builders, showing up every day not to prove anything to the world, but to ourselves. We celebrated small victories like they were miraculous: our first client referral, our first full-scale kitchen redesign, our first project that came in under budget and ahead of schedule. I trademarked the name Nova Forma and launched a website built by hand on a Sunday evening. It was simple, clean, honest, just like us. And slowly people started to notice, not the press, not the old guard, but the people we built for. Our designs started popping up on social media. Homeowners showing off smart lighting systems, sleek cabinetry made from reclaimed wood, floor plans that felt both luxurious and lived in. We weren't trying to be loud. We were trying to be lasting. And in an industry driven by legacy, we were building something even more powerful: trust. I kept my name off the company's about page. No photo, no background. Just the work. Let them judge the designs, not the bloodline. For the first time, I wasn't seeking approval. I was writing my own rules. It took just under 2 years for the ripple to become a wave. At first, Nova Forma was just a name whispered among boutique developers and small design circles. A dark horse, an underdog firm doing surprisingly high-end work without the ego that often accompanied it. We weren't aiming to be disruptors. We simply did things differently. We listened, we customized, we prioritized sustainability and innovation without sacrificing elegance. But we didn't stay small. Slowly, the projects grew. From kitchen remodels and custom lofts, we moved into full home redesigns, new builds, and collaborations with up-and-coming tech developers who wanted their smart homes to look as intelligent as they operated. We created spaces that breathed, that adapted, that felt human and forward, thinking at once. And then came the contracts. Not just 1 or 2, but a string of mid-sized commercial projects we quietly won through blind bidding. No names, no pedigree. Just numbers, renderings, and proposals. What no one knew, not the selection committee, not the other firms bidding, was that Nova Forma was beginning to outperform Carter & Sons. One project, then another. At first, I thought it was coincidence. Then I realized it was inevitability. They had stopped evolving. We had been born evolving. I kept my distance from my old life. I didn't watch their press releases or check their LinkedIn profiles. But the industry is small, and word always finds a way through the cracks. I heard about the layoffs first. Junior designers, then admin staff, then a senior project director I once idolized. Then came the loss of a state-funded sustainable housing contract that Carter and Sons had assumed was in the bag. But it wasn't. We had won it. Not because of a name, but because of merit. That contract changed everything. Suddenly, Nova Forma was no longer a whisper. It was a presence. I remember the first time I saw our name in a trade publication. Not on the cover. Not even in a feature. Just mentioned in a paragraph about the future of adaptive residential architecture. But seeing it in print made it real in a new way. I sat in my studio that night, staring at the article, thinking how strange it was that the firm my father told me would never survive without his last name was now being studied by firms still using his. The irony was sharp, but I didn't laugh. I just felt still. Then came the expo, a regional industry showcase I had attended many times before. But this time, Nova Forma had a booth. Clean, simple, intentional. A digital loop of our past projects, a team dressed in dark neutrals, a quiet air of confidence. We weren't trying to draw a crowd. We were just showing up. But crowds came anyway. Designers, developers, even journalists. Then, halfway through day 2, I saw them. My brothers, Landon and Tyler, standing 20 feet away at the Carter and Sons booth. Their display was twice the size, but half as full. I watched as a developer we had just signed walked right past them and over to me, extending a hand with a grin. "You're the one behind Nova Forma, right? I've been hoping to meet you." That moment didn't come with fireworks or applause. It came with quiet clarity. We had arrived. The official moment everything changed came on a gray Thursday morning, one of those days where the sky feels low and quiet, like the world is holding its breath. I was in the studio, reviewing a site logistics plan with my team, when my assistant rushed in with her phone in hand and eyes wide. "You need to see this?" she said. On the screen was a breaking news headline: Nova Forma founder revealed Madison Carter, heir to Carter and Sons. My heart stopped for just a second. I hadn't planned on this. I hadn't given a single interview, hadn't submitted a press release. But someone had put the pieces together. A client maybe, or a former Carter employee. It didn't matter. The secret was out. Within an hour, my inbox was a firestorm. Journalists requesting interviews. Clients offering congratulations. Former colleagues suddenly remembering how much they always believed in me. But the message that stood out was the one that simply read. Dad saw it. He hasn't said a word since. It was from my mother. That one line said more than any article ever could. Later that evening, my publicist called with an offer, a national televised interview, primetime, full segment, focus on the journey, the quiet rise, the reveal. She asked, "Do you want to do it?" I didn't answer right away. I walked to the window and looked out over the city that had watched me build in silence. Part of me wanted to say no, to protect the quiet I had grown to love. But another part, the one that remembered the boardroom, the dismissal, the smirks, knew it was time. Not for revenge. For recognition. "Yes," I said. "Let's do it." The interview aired that Sunday. I wore a slate, gray suit, no accessories, no designer flash. Just clean lines and presence. The segment opened with images of Nova Forma's work. Homes that glowed with modern warmth, spaces designed for people to live, not just impress. Then came the story. The host told it beautifully: the overlooked daughter of a legacy firm, dismissed, silenced, underestimated. And then, the founder of one of the fastest growing design firms on the East Coast. When she asked the big question, "Why did you keep your identity hidden for so long?" I looked into the camera and said calmly, "Because I wanted to be valued for the work, not the name. And maybe, because I needed to prove to myself that I didn't need anyone's permission to succeed." The response was overwhelming. Overnight, our website traffic tripled. Investment offers poured in. Requests for collaboration came from firms I used to admire from afar. But the part that meant the most wasn't the success. It was that people finally saw me not as the girl from Carter and Sons, but as the woman who had built something new entirely on her own terms. And I knew deep down, this was just the beginning. It didn't take long for the invitation to arrive. A heavy, cream-colored envelope with my parents' address embossed in gold. Lancaster family dinner. This Sunday, 6 p.m. No handwritten note, no message. Just tradition. I hadn't stepped foot in that house in nearly 3 years. Not since I left without a sound. Not since I decided I'd no longer play the part they'd assigned me. But now, after everything, after the interview, the headlines, the flood of attention, they wanted me back at the table. I didn't RSVP. I just showed up. When I pulled into the driveway in the quiet hum of my new electric car. A car I had chosen not for its price tag but for its values. I saw them already gathered inside through the tall front windows. The house looked the same. The people in it didn't. I walked up the steps slowly, heels quiet against the stone, and knocked. My mother opened the door, wearing a practiced smile. "Madison," she said softly, almost like a question. "You came." I nodded and stepped inside. The room fell quiet. Landon and Tyler sat on opposite ends of the dining table, flanked by their wives. My father stood at the far end, a glass of whiskey in hand, staring at me like he didn't quite know what version of me he was looking at. I walked in without apology, without hesitation, and took the seat that had always been left empty, always saved for someone who never arrived. This time, I claimed it. Dinner began with strained conversation. Updates about kids, company news, investments. No one mentioned Nova Forma. No one mentioned the interview. Until Landon finally broke. "You could have told us," he said, setting his glass down with a little more force than necessary. "Instead of going behind our backs." I met his eyes calmly. "Behind your backs? Or simply forward without your permission?" He scoffed. "You used what we taught you?" I shook my head. "No, I used what you ignored." "There's a difference." Tyler jumped in next. "Do you know what kind of position this puts us in?" I raised an eyebrow. "What position is that?" "Being second." My father cleared his throat, his voice low but direct. "This company, our name, has stood for generations." I leaned forward. "And what happens when a name becomes a wall instead of a foundation?" He didn't answer. Because he knew. We all did. The rest of the dinner passed in silence. Tense, but telling. When it ended, my father stood at the door, looking at me like a man who had finally read a chapter too late. "You really did it," he said. Not an apology, but not an insult, either. I met his eyes. "No," I said. "I'm still doing it." And then I walked out, leaving behind the table that once rejected me. Finally full. Finally irrelevant. After the dinner, I didn't hear from any of them for weeks. Not my father. Not my brothers. Not even my mother, who usually reached out to smooth the silence. And truthfully, I didn't expect to. The family name had always stood for power, but their definition of power had never included people like me. Quiet, persistent, unwilling to beg. I'd spent so long measuring myself against their approval that I hadn't realized I no longer needed it. Because real power doesn't come from a name etched in a stone wall or on the corner of a blueprint. It comes from building something no one else can take away. That's what Nova Forma had become. It was no longer a gamble or a rebellion. It was a force. Every day, more clients came. Not because of who I was, but because of what we delivered. Our spaces weren't just beautiful. They were intuitive, efficient, livable. Homes that adapted to people's lives instead of asking people to adapt to them. Offices that flowed with light and intention. Developments that respected the land they were built on. We didn't pitch perfection. We pitched purpose. And it resonated. We opened a second studio in Chicago, then another in Austin, each one managed by people who had once been passed over, sidelined, told to wait their turn. Now, they were leading, designing, shaping the future. I hired more women, more first-gen professionals, more creatives with voices that had never been welcomed in the old guard of architecture. We weren't just building spaces. We were building a different kind of industry culture, one that didn't rely on legacy, one that didn't tolerate gatekeeping, one that knew innovation often comes from the people you overlook. I received a letter one day from a former professor who once told me I was too idealistic for real-world design. He'd seen a Nova Forma project featured in Architectural Digest. In the letter, he apologized for underestimating me. I kept the note, not for validation, but as a reminder that people can change. But I didn't need them to in order to succeed. At one point, a major investor approached us. He offered to acquire the company, promising global reach, full backing, and brand elevation. I read the proposal, sat across from him in a polished boardroom, and slid the papers back without even countering. "We didn't come this far," I said, "just to put someone else's name on the door." He didn't understand. That was fine. Not everyone needed to. One morning, I was walking into the New York studio when a young woman stopped me outside. She couldn't have been more than 25. She said, "You're the reason I'm applying to design school. I saw your interview. I didn't know people like us could do this." I smiled. "We always could," I told her. "They just didn't want us to know it." That's when I understood the real power of what we had built. Not the revenue, not the market share, but the ripple effect. The idea that someone out there was sitting at a desk, sketching dreams, no longer waiting for permission. That somewhere, the next girl told she wasn't one of them had decided to become something greater. And this time, there'd be no one standing in her way. A few months after the summit, I walked through the doors of Carter & Sons for the first time in years. Not as an employee, not as an heir, but as a guest consultant. Their company had been quietly declining, their projects stale, their clients drifting toward firms with fresher visions and faster execution. For the first time, they admitted they needed help, and not just from anyone from me. They had reached out through formal channels, requesting a meeting to discuss a potential partnership or restructuring plan. I accepted. Not for them, but for myself. Closure doesn't always come wrapped in apology. Sometimes, it arrives in silence and acknowledgement. In finally being heard after years of being ignored.